kind of moving outside the lottery, but still sort of inside the lottery. I have seen Tai Tai Washington mocked all over the place. Is he a lottery prospect? And what can you tell us about him?
Yeah. Tai Tai role dependent this past year at Kentucky. So I think he's definitely a lottery prospect. He's a guy that I have a lottery grade on right now. I would not be shocked if he falls outside the top 20. And the reason for that is, there's a continued lack of understanding of circumstance that goes into the evaluation process. And that's not to call out NBA teams or decision makers. They do an unbelievable job with much more information than all of us who are kind of public facing right now are ever able to wrap our heads around. But two things stand out to me with Tai Tai Washington, really three things. One is the miscast role at Kentucky. He was played next to a non-shooting pass-first point guard in Sharif Wheeler and a non-shooting big man who lived in, literally brought a tent to the lane with him for games in Oscar Tshiebwe. And those two ran pick and roll all the time and or got their touches in different ways. And Tai Tai Washington's a really good passer and playmaker, but he also happens to be a very good shooter. And when there are three guys that all are talented enough to deserve to be on the floor, and one of them is a good shooter, guess which role he gets siphoned into? He's having the ball taken out of his hands and saying, in order to make this work from a talent perspective, we need you to shoot. So Tai Tai Washington is running off screens, spotting up on the perimeter, not getting a ton of reps with the ball in his hands. There were a couple games this year when Sharif Wheeler, the point guard of Kentucky, was out. And in one of them against Georgia, I think Williams had 14 or 15 assists and only 2 turnovers. Like, the pick and roll upside for this guy when someone commits to letting him be him is huge. And the context there is that we've seen this time and time again from Kentucky guys that go to the NBA. As a Knicks fan, this was the exact thing that I was saying 2 years ago about Emmanuel Quickley, that high school, more of a point guard, has a lot more lead skills with the ball in his hands that he was allowed to show at Kentucky because of who he shared the floor with. And that was Tyrese Maxey. Both of them really good NBA players now. Both of them deserve to have the ball in their hands, but the context of the college situation really took that away. So I think the best days of Tai Tai Washington and what he does to maximize his value, we haven't seen at Kentucky. The other part of the equation that has to be mentioned is an ankle injury that he suffered in the middle part of the year, and the fact that his mother has had some ongoing illnesses drawing him and his attention, his emotional impact away from basketball at that time. I don't view that as a negative. I think that's just a fact of the situation that, he cares about a lot of things outside of basketball. And I'm really sick of seeing that be held against prospects and say, oh, does he really love the game enough? Like, no, his mother's sick. He needs to have his attention on other things at this time. Right. And athletically, he didn't look the same coming back from an ankle injury. So I look at the entirety of the context, and I think that he's one guy, because he's not a fantastic athlete, that continues to get dropped down boards. But the Kentucky effect is real, folks. How many guards come out of that place time and time again and outperform their draft slot? Like, it happens pretty much every year. Tai Tai's the one guy this year. I think he's a lottery prospect, but I can easily see a world where he slides down boards.
It's interesting to me that he would slide, even given the off-court concerns are bullshit. I hate that stuff too. It was just like one of the most egregious recent examples was Anthony Edwards. Does he like the game enough? And it's like, just shut the fuck up about that already, please.
Jalen Brown too. Like, I'm a Celtics fan.
Oh yeah. What that was, like, he's too smart.
Yes.
Or something for his own good. Oh my God.
Yeah. And Washington, like, super philanthropic, has interests and loves to give back in the community. Like, how is anyone ever going to try to spin that into a negative? Just that he has other interests outside of basketball. And it's this huge, movement from decision makers that they just want basketball and impact, and no risk to try to take him away from it. But it's crap at the end of the day.
And even given all that, it surprises me that he would slide outside the lottery in a draft that is just like bereft of point guard talent anywhere near the top. And so I just assumed that, I guess maybe it comes down to the needs of certain teams, but even just, you would think that his skill set and what he does is just so in demand because of the scarcity of it throughout the rest of this first round.
Yep, no doubt about it. So I'm a huge Tai Tai fan. I know Knicks fans are sick of seeing him mocked to the Knicks at 11. I think that the inclusion of Shaedon Sharpe, the recent ascent of Dyson Daniels, probably takes him a little bit lower than that range. Like he's the one guy that's going to continue to get notched down a little bit because of a couple other guys rising. And again, the inclusion of Shaedon Sharpe.
I'm sorry, I'm skipping ahead here. What's fueling Malachi Brenham's draft board ascension? Is it just the stuff I've read and watched? There's the off-ball shooting, but there are people that think that he can create and that he showed as much later in the season. Is that what's fueling it? Do you believe in it? Can you break that down for us, please?
Yeah, it's definitely what's fueling it and turning him into another one of those lottery guys. Again, the physical differences that he has from Tai Tai Washington are the reasons why his stock is rising, and he may end up leapfrogging Tai Tai on some boards. I'm not a huge Malachi Branham guy, but at the end of the day, I understand the appeal. Big guards or wings who have decent feel, solid catch and shoot threats, and physically ready, they draw a lot of attention. I don't want to take away from what Branham did either. Like, it was really impressive for him to anchor an offense in the second half of the year in the Big Ten as an 18-year-old. And he did really well at it, scoring the basketball. But I don't buy his shot creation for others. It's a skill that can be developed in the NBA, but I look at his natural propensity to want to play slow, to try to feel contact, and to fall in love with the mid-range. And those are areas that I just don't love with if I'm looking for a guy that's going to be a number 1 or 2 option on an NBA team. I'd rather take a bet on the high-flying athletes or the guys who are just great with space creation over the guys who are tough shot makers when they don't have space. That's more so what Malachi Branham is. There's appeal, there's value to it. It makes for a great mixtape in a lot of different regards. But he's also pretty far away defensively. So concerns in that regard to me. Understand why he's moving up draft boards in a lot of different areas, but not a guy that I would go out of my way to invest in.
This qualifies as a non-lottery question, but if you had your druthers, it would be a lottery question. Why are you so bullish on Jaden Hardy? I believe you have him at number 6 on your big board.
Huge Jaden Hardy fan. I don't want to spend the 8 minutes that go into every single detail about why I love him, because I don't want to bore anybody to death. But I try to focus a little bit more on, again, the circumstances that these prospects are playing in before they get into the NBA. And what I can't get past is how impressive it is to have an 18-year-old waltz into a professional league with probably the second or third most talent in the world, like the G League has right now, and command a number 1 leading role in an offense. That in itself shows how high Jaden Hardy's offensive ceiling is. The circumstances were not great around him, surrounded by 4 non-shooters, literally 4 other guys that he was playing with.
Like playing for the Lakers.
They're sub 30% from 3, Dan. Like, it's not just that they're inefficient, like they're really inefficient shooters. And I get it. Dyson Daniels is improving and got better as the season went on, but he didn't operate in space. And because he's not an elite athlete, you look bad when you don't have the physical ability to just get past guys when they're all blockading the rim from you. He's going to thrive in the modern NBA game. Bet on scorers, bet on guys who have good handles, underrated passer and playmaker. Like, I see a decent amount of a Jordan Poole-ish type of guy in him. 3-level shot maker, but underrated feel, underrated playmaker. And it's so hard for me to look past guys who are 18 years old and just come in and can score 19 a game in a professional league. I can't get past that.
If I said the over-under for him getting drafted was number, let's say 21, are you going to take if you're guessing as to what's going to happen, you think you're going to take going higher than 21 or lower than 21?
I think he goes before the 21st pick. I think that there's going to be a franchise that kind of talks themselves into the upside on that regard. And I think that he's a guy that's going to work out incredibly well in a 1-on-0 setting. So if some team gets in there, brings him in and falls in love with what they see, I think he's going to impress.
I'd be curious if, assuming Tai Tai Washington goes, the Rockets having that second pick at 17, they still don't necessarily have a point guard solution. I don't know, based off what you say about Hardy, whether I love the idea of him and Jalen Green together, though.
Yeah, it would be interesting. There's no doubt about that. But yeah, I think Houston at 17. Like, I wouldn't mind Cleveland at 14 taking that gamble. and slotting him as more of a scorer next to Darius Garland or that third option in the backcourt if they keep Colin Sexton long-term. Like I've even thought about Atlanta taking a little bit of a risk there at 16 and just putting another guy who can create his own shot so Trae Young can play more off ball. I think that's always been an underutilized part of his game because he's a really good three-point shooter and particularly good off movement. So a lot of avenues that I could justify. But again, it only takes one, guys. Only takes one team to fall in love with a prospect and pick them a little bit higher than consensus might.
Speaking of falling in love, every year there's at least one prospect I become infatuated with who's not mocked or considered a top 10 player or whatever, or even a lottery prospect. You were able to guess based off the questions that I sent you which one mine was this year. And it is Bryce McGowan's. Is he a top 20 pick? And am I, like, me looking at this is I've called this the my Shai Gilgeous-Alexander infatuation, because that's kind of the year, it might have been the year before and it started. I was infatuated with him and couldn't understand why he wasn't going. I was livid when the Knicks didn't pick him. Is he a worthwhile selection for my affections in this category? And we should apologize for his career arc as well, because I've fallen in love with him now. That can only mean probably spell bad things for him.
Dan, did Shai Gilgeous-Alexander go in the same draft as Kevin Knox? Was that the Knox year?
That, I feel like that was uncalled for. It was topical, but it was totally uncalled for.
Yeah, you're right. I'm sorry. But no, like I think McGowan's is worth a top 20 pick. I'm not necessarily sure if he's going to get picked in the top 20. And there's a growing trend around the NBA right now of guys who go to the NBA draft combine who work to protect their stock. They remove themselves from 5v5 scrimmages because they don't want to have a poor showing and make teams rethink the first round buzz that they've already drawn. What inevitably happens year after year is one or two guys who do play and show really well end up getting a boost up their board because of the competitiveness factor. And NBA teams are going to look there and say, well, this guy was willing to bet on himself. He just loves basketball. And there's that favorite saying of ours coming back in. And as a competitor, we want to reward him for that. Those are the guys we want on our locker room. And that particularly happens outside of the top 15 or 16, because those are playoff teams that are generally picking there. And competitiveness fits in with their win now type of mentality. McGowan's did not play, did not participate in the 5-on-5 stuff. And I think that hurt him in the long run. I don't know if I'd advise him to do differently, but I think that it ends up hurting him a little bit because there were a couple guys like Jalen Williams out of Santa Clara who bet on themselves, showed a little bit higher, and now might leapfrog him in draft position. I really like what McGowan's brings to the table. 6'6", 6'7", right on that borderline as a lead guard handler. Super aggressive, a lot of size and raw tools there with his length, and he gets to the free throw line a ton. There's something about lead guards that generate free throws at a high rate that I fall in love with. These are guys that you swing on, whether it's him, whether it's Jaden Hardy. Like, go after guys that have incredibly high upside to become a 3-level scorer and or can anchor an offense, because at the very least, if they hit the 70th percentile outcome of what they can become, then they are a really valuable microwave scorer off the bench. So I love McGowan's. I'm right there with you. I have him, I think, 16th or 17th on my board right now. But I think the guessing games over who goes where outside of the top 15 become really challenging. And maybe it's recency bias for me coming out of the combine, but a lot of those guys like him, like Blake Wesley out of Notre Dame, Dalen Terry from Arizona, they chose not to play. And ultimately that may come back to bite them.
Who are some prospects that really juiced up their stock at the draft combine?
Yeah, Jalen Williams was one of them out of Santa Clara, more of a mid-major who's starting to get some steam and then played incredibly well and just showed up a ton of what he can do. 6'6" with a 7'2" wingspan, like super long arms. Shot the ball really well from three this last year and has a little bit of 3-level scoring upside. Another guy who helped himself was Jake Laravia from Wake Forest. There are rumors out there that he is a first-round promise. I can neither confirm nor deny that, but very solid, high IQ ball mover and spot-up shooter. And then I think Christian Brown out of Kansas just won a national championship, hyper competitive, like brings a little bit of that Grayson Allen, like walk into every building and be the villain and loves that role type of mentality to him. And I think that there's going to be some team in the 18 to 28 range that's going to fall in love with that and say, you know what, I don't want to play against that guy. Let's make sure he's on our team and has a little bit of that winning trait to him. So those are three guys that really help themselves, but can't get past Dyson Daniels for the G League Ignite. He had the best individual workout there and saw himself go from a fringe top 10 pick to almost knocking on the door of top 5 with the way he shot the basketball and just was able to showcase all the things he can do at his size.
Fair warning, I'll be editing that out of the podcast as I try to get him to fall to the Knicks. You mentioned that there's just a ton of unpredictability once you get to a spot in this draft. Are there any teams outside the top 10 picks that you're just sort of endlessly fascinated by?
I mentioned Atlanta at 16 a little bit earlier. Like, I don't know what fit or need is necessarily going to be for them. They have a decent amount of young guys. Like, they got Jalen Johnson and Sharif Cooper in the draft last year, who I was fascinated by. I think we're getting ready to the point where Onyeka Okongwu deserves a little bit bigger a role in their organization. But they kind of stalled out a little bit after making the big playoff run that they did a year ago. And I would not be shocked if they view this as a time to make some sort of a consolidation deal to try to move around a lot of their parts if this pick is for sale, or if Schlenk, if he keeps the pick, what direction he goes. Do they just want another veteran to come in and be able to help them right away? Like a guy like Ochai Agbaji out of Kansas, who can just be that solid 3-and-D prospect, might make sense there. Or is he going to continue to roll the dice on those high ceiling prospects like they did last year? A lot of different variables at play there. And then I think we also have to mention Charlotte for intriguing teams, because they have both 13 and 15, and they desperately need a high caliber big man. Did they trade any of these?
Wait, coaching wasn't the problem there?
Last time we were together, we put the James Borrego jinx on things. So let's make sure we're very clear about this. They need rim protection in order for their defense to be better. I think they're going to address it this year. Do they go with a guy like Williams or Duren in the draft? Do they package those picks to move up to get the right guy? Do they make some sort of a draft night trade in order to get an established veteran? Like, there's so many possibilities that could happen there. I think Charlotte's another team to watch.
I mean, going on for some reason, a lot of Charlotte radio stations and shows lately, maybe they like to make their fans angry, which is why they bring me on. I said repeatedly, I'll be floored if there's not, and I'm not talking about moving up, just because I don't think if you want a rim protector, moving up isn't going to do them any good unless they're vaulting into the top 3, obviously. I'd be floored if one or both of these picks isn't used in a deal, even if the news comes after the draft that brings in a veteran just to upgrade at the 5 spot. Just given how they acted after the offseason, getting rid of James Borrego, sort of making it feel like they took a step back this year, even though they won more games, even though I'd argue that finishing outside the top 10 in defensive efficiency was probably overachieving relative to the personnel that they had. I will be flabbergasted if one or both of these picks isn't used to net a more veteran 5.
Yep. And look, you never know how the DeAndre Ayton or Rudy Gobert sweepstakes are going to shake out over the next month or two. So Charlotte's they're just a fascinating player.
A lot of people have mentioned about how clumped together sort of I don't want to say the bottom of the draft is, but like the middle of the draft is. Yeah. And I don't think I understood the extent of it until I posed you the question, are there some second round prospects that we should keep an eye on? To which you responded by saying, well, players 22 to 50 are just absurdly close together. So are there any players in that range, that clump, that we should be keeping an eye on? And I think that's for fans of just teams that are good or contenders, maybe who don't have picks or looking to pick up an extra pick. Like, those are the types of prospects that are super interesting, because you want to see if your team can land someone like that or put themselves in a position to get someone like that if they don't have a pick already.
Yeah, it's a lot of years we talk about themes with draft classes, and the pervasive theme coming into this part of the draft cycle was a little bit weaker at the top than normal, okay depth around the top 10, and then not a lot of great guys when you get to the later part of the first round. And I think that that's not necessarily changing. I think the top end talent in this draft class is getting better, but there's just no way to predict what happens once you get outside the top 20. Like it's going to be really hard to do. Any mainstream outlets, any people you talk to, like, there are at least 50 guys that are deserving of a first round grade in this draft class for whatever that means. So the different directions you go in that area, you go the young route and you take more of a project, you get them on that 4-year contract in the, final couple slots of the first round, and or really prioritize them when there's low risk to the organization in the earlier parts of the second. You could go for the more prized veteran, the guy that you feel really comfortable is just going to come in and be a solid, sturdy role player, so that outside of the top 22 or 23, which, as we said earlier, is the kind of cutoff line for you only get 22 or 23 really good guys in each class. When you're drafting outside of that, you just go for a guy that you think, hey, let's hit singles instead of swing for the fences. I don't really know. I think it's going to be team dependent. I think there's probably going to be a good deal of movement that goes on in those rounds. So what I'll bring to the table for you instead, Dan, are 2 guys that I don't think are going to jump up into the first round, but will return excellent value for where they're drafted in the second. One of them is Trayvion Williams out of Purdue. I'm a huge fan of his because he is the best passer in this draft. Not just for a big man, he's the best passer in this draft. Like super, super creative. He's needed to work on his body and slim down. He's done that. He needs to add a little bit more 3-point range. He's getting there. Defensively, he's not a rim protector, and he plays a 5-man spot. There was some questions about usage at Purdue. He's played out of the post a ton, but his game as a playmaker translates to any facet of basketball, that he's a plug and play, really good offensive option. And if he adds a 3-point shot, I think the offensive additions for a team are very much worth some of the shortcomings he might have on defense. Another guy I'm super big on is Ron Harper Jr. When you hear Ron Harper, you think of those big physical kind of point guard like his dad, right? Ron Harper Jr. is a hoss, like a load and a half physically, and fits into this modern positional versatility, switchable defender who can guard 1 through 4 and shoot close to 40% from 3. Because he did that this year for Rutgers. He was 39.8% from 3 on really good volume. Because he's so strong, has long arms with a over 7-foot wingspan, can finish at the basket and is crafty and strong about getting there. And he guards every type of position that you want. I think a high utility player type of role guy that I would love to get my hands on in the second round. So Trayvion Williams out of Purdue, Ron Harper Jr. out of Rutgers, 2 guys that I think will go in the second and outperform their draft stock.
Wrapping up with these cookie cutter categories.
Sure.
Which prospects are you much higher on relative to consensus in the, since we've already talked about him, non-Jaden Hardy division, of course?
Yeah, the non-Jaden Hardys. I like Blake Wesley out of Notre Dame. I have a top 20 grade on him, mid-first round grade. Just love the upside and the tools that he has. Very far away, though, super raw, but can be a 3-level scorer in the NBA while having a 6'11" wingspan, which allows him to be a positive defender. I also like Max Christie out of Michigan State. He has some 3-point range to his game. He did not shoot the ball incredibly well for a specialist this year in his freshman year with the Spartans, but a really good complementary guy. I mentioned it earlier with Benedict Mathurin. Things that I value personally are movement shooters, guys who create gravity, move in space, and are consistent 3-point threats. I think Christie gets there eventually, and I'm not willing to talk myself out of him because of a smaller 35 game sample size in his college year where he didn't shoot the ball particularly well. He's also a solid defender. So I do like Christie quite a bit.
Which prospects are you much lower on relative to consensus?
All right. So AJ Griffin, I know we talked about earlier. Like I barely have him in my top 20. I'm really, really worried about the defense.
Spicy.
Like, it is spicy. And a lot of these have not worked out for me in the past. Like I think I had LaMelo Ball like 17th or 18th on my board a couple of years ago. So like, let's just ruin my credibility. I'm happy to throw that out there, but I own it. And hopefully someday, again, I want Griffin to prove me wrong. Hopefully someday I'm able to look back at this and learn a lot of things about projecting guys who are questionable if Griffin does prove me wrong. So certainly welcome that. Also not a huge Malachi Branham guy, just because as I said earlier, I don't love really physical guys who don't create space. And I think his mid-range heavy arsenal doesn't fit the modern game in the way that I'd like it to. Kennedy Chandler out of Tennessee. I don't see the value in drafting undersized point guards. Like each of the last couple of years, there've been guys that I think are first round talents. Sharif Cooper out of Auburn, Trey Jones, who was out of Duke, plays with the San Antonio Spurs now. They fall to the middle, later parts of the second round because there's just not a ton of versatility you can have with those guys. And then Christian Coloco. Now, he gets first-round grades, big man out of Arizona. A lot of people like him, but 22-year-old bigs rarely go in the first round. So I would much rather try to make the swing on him later. And I don't think he does any one thing well enough to be draftable in a top 35 circumstance right now. So that's a little bit of a spicy take compared to the mainstream right now. But again, we had that conversation about bigs and trying to figure out exactly where do you value drafting them. I think if you don't see a high pathway to upside, you probably avoid taking a guy even in the second round. So I'm kind of out on Coloco and Chandler and don't love the modern fit of Branham and AJ Griffin.
Anything else that I haven't asked you about that you think needs to be touched on with regards to this year's draft?
Well, Dan, I'm going to ask you a question and put you on the spot a little bit, which is not something that you're going to be unprepared for. But as I start preparing my own draft analysis here, trying to get a really good feel for what teams will do and which ones are the intriguing ones to watch. I know we mentioned Charlotte and Atlanta as being potential movers. Would love to hear from you. Knicks, what is the position that they really need if they need a position? And what type of player do they need to be targeting if they're not going by a certain position?
So I would say they just need to take the best player available because I don't think there's anyone on the roster you tailor your future around right now. And that just includes RJ Barrett. I think he showed a lot of growth over the past 2 years. The increased rim pressure is great. The finishing is not. I think there's more passing chops to be explored. They have neither given him that opportunity consistently. I've been very impressed with the defense over the past 2 seasons for the most part. And so I'm taking whoever I just deem the best player available there. If I had to boil it down to a position, I still think they need a lead playmaker. And I just don't think you're going to get that at number 11, which is why I default to, can you just get into like the 6'6" to 6'8" guy range, someone who's either going to work on defense or gives you complementary shooting or both. That's why I'm just currently in love with Dyson Daniels. I think what they absolutely should not do is trade this pick for a non-star. If it's going to be, it's not going to get you a star on its own, but if someone we're not talking about becomes available and you need to bake it into a package, fine. Otherwise, I would be focused on just sort of seeing what you have in the youth of your roster, including this pick, because I still don't think you have a great idea. If people have asked me, I could ask you, who are the Knicks' tentpole prospects right now? If we're being honest, it's either no one or just RJ Barrett. I love Emmanuel Quickley. Obi Toppin's a shot of adrenaline. Quentin Grimes, Deuce McBride, they're intriguing. That Cam Reddish trade was a unmitigated disaster at this point. They're sort of just still wandering in the wilderness at this point because they doubled down too heavily on a season that was clearly an anomaly. And so I don't know which route they go. It would not shock me though if by the time next season tips off, we find out that the Knicks traded this pick for just a non-star addition, which to their credit would be a little out of character. We've seen them be somewhat creative within this front office around the draft.
Yeah. I think the Knicks and the Wizards are the 2 hardest teams for me to peg, and they come right at 10 and 11, those rounding the corner parts of the lottery, and can have a lot of impact on the draft moving down. So the better feel we can get for what's going to happen there, I think that those are not necessarily shake-up spots, but like it's going to set the stage for what other teams afterwards can really do.
You had DM'd me about Washington, and you think they should be a candidate to try and aggressively move up if they can get into Jaden Ivey territory. Like that's the guy that you would consider if you can move up for in your Washington to try and do it.
I don't know what Washington is right now. Like, are they trying to win now? Because their roster doesn't suggest that they have the pieces to do so, but they're not trying to rebuild either because they don't have enough youth and their contract statuses are quickly running out of flexibility to be able to make a lot of big moves because Bradley Beal is going to be worth a fortune over the next couple of years. I think they need to go in on finding a point guard because they're the one team that has a glaring need if they're going to try to make a push for the postseason. And Ivy, again, the availability at 4 with Sacramento intrigues me to the point where if Washington could construct some sort of a deal to try to move up and get Ivy, I think that that's a huge franchise tentpole that allows you to split the difference, to be really taken care of in the long term because you have a future star, and to find the positional fit and a little bit of an instant impact to play with Bradley Beal right away. So I know Wizards fans are probably not in love with adding another hyper athlete and ball dominant guy next to Bradley Beal, because we've seen the last two kind of fizzle out in Washington in that regard. But I'm a big believer in Jaden Ivey. And if they can swing it at 4, I'd be all for it. But I mean, there's so many other avenues that they could go down and try to get a guard that can come in and complement Bradley Beal right away.
To your credit, they also tried to slow down like Spencer Dinwiddie, and that didn't work alongside Bradley Beal either. And so you're going to run out of options eventually. And I think the more salient point is if you do go out and get Ivy, if you trust his shooting and ability to play off the ball in time, it works with Bradley Beal, but it might be just as critical that this is someone who sets you up for the future. Should it be, if we're being honest, despite what's being said, Bradley Beal is not going to come close to finish his next contract in Washington. That's the reality of the situation. The other two teams I want to mention really quickly, I think this is more out of want. And you sold me on Benedict Mathurin before this pod when I was watching the videos that you've done on him. If New Orleans can get him, I'm like, okay, this is someone who comes in, helps right away. They get Zion back. They use their mid-level and biannual and free agency. This gets really interesting. But just watching them after they started 3-16, knowing what they did against Phoenix, knowing who's coming back, knowing the makeup of this team, I really just want them to I want a player who fits to become available that they can go out and acquire in a consolidation trade, because that number 8 pick it's not expendable, but like they're a team that can absolutely justify moving that level of selection.
And they can do it because they hit on so many rookies this year. The track record that they're developing of drafting is really impressive, so that they have the flexibility to, if they really need to, and it's time to go all in, trade one of those future picks because they've hit so well on kind of undrafted guys or second round picks.
What is their need though? Is it they just need more shooting on the perimeter, or is it a floor spacing rim protector next to Zion? And then when you have that latter discussion, as I have had with a few Pelicans fans who vehemently disagree with me, which is totally fine, Jonas Valanciunas is really good. You have Larry Nance Jr. I still don't like Jackson Hayes' game, maybe particularly for this roster, but he gave you some really solid moments this year while also playing next to Jonas Valanciunas. So that sort of complicates it. But it feels like I would have my own preferable biggest need, but it feels like there's not a consensus on what this team needs most.
I'd say that they need shooting without sacrificing defense. And you can put whatever position on that you want. But when Zion comes back, he needs the floor spaced around him. So if you're going to add anybody else to this team, make sure they can shoot without sacrificing defense.
I really want to see Zion under Willie Green, just the transition defensive mindset he instilled. I'm just wondering if that will reach Zion as well. And just the last team, and I think they're quietly like, there's an aimlessness to what they're doing in a good way. The Spurs.
Yeah.
Because they have 3 first-round picks, one of which falls in the lottery at number 9. Then they have number 20 and they have number 25, correct? Yeah.
And 38 as well. Early second rounder at 38.
That's a dangerous pick for the San Antonio Spurs to have. I could absolutely see them just keeping all of these picks. There's maybe one draft and stash in there, and then they're still bringing in 3 rookies. But they're also they're just in this weird spot where unless you're moving DeJounte Murray, I don't know that you can, and I don't think they should. I want to be clear. You can't get much worse, because who are you moving aside from Murray that actually makes you a lot worse? As good as Vasel is, as good as I thought Keldon Johnson showed a lot of progress this past season. At the same time, if you're asking whether you're ready to compete, the question has to be, and I know there are only a handful of guys where the answer is yes, can DeJounte Murray be the best player on a contender? I think the most favorable response is that remains to be determined. I would lean towards no. Then you have to ask, well, is that player potentially on our roster, or are we going to be able to bag him in this draft or upcoming drafts? I know the Spurs find value everywhere, but you could also argue the answer there is no, because they're going to be perpetually just drafting around this spot. Yeah. And so if you told me they made a consolidation trade because they seem more open to making moves like that now, given what they did with DeMar DeRozan and then Derek White, if you told me they went that route and they tried to get Zach LaVine in a sign and trade, or there was someone who cropped up on the open market, that wouldn't shock me and I'd support it. If you told me that they tried to somehow gut the roster, they're taking just the biggest swings possible in the draft, I'd be all for that. I am so curious as to, and by the way, they might have the most cap space in the league, depending on how some of these books shake out. I cannot wrap my head around San Antonio's direction. And normally that would be cause for me to be down on it. But I find myself like exhilarated by it.
Yeah, I think it's finally like the Spurs have always been an organization that's a little bit more quiet and sits out a lot of big deals or doesn't make huge splashes in free agency. This is the year when they could really be aggressive, and we've never seen what that turns into for them. Like the Marcus Aldridge year was a little bit different, but this is going to be huge. We let off a lot of this talk with the Kings and trying to say like how hard is it to predict what they're going to do. And I feel the same way with the Spurs, but we give San Antonio the benefit of the doubt because whatever it is that they end up doing, like they're typically right. They get proven right as time goes on. So I am more inclined to say like, I'm not going to try to figure it out before the draft, but I'm going to wait in the later parts of July and see how all of it comes together and say, man, why didn't I think of that? That actually makes a lot of sense for this organization. So I just can't wait to see how they get to that point.
They're the one team that I'm okay with taking Dyson Daniels before the Knicks because it's not right before them. So this isn't like a Steph Curry situation, but it's also okay. If Dyson Daniels is going to wind up there, maybe he just ends up turning into a stud. And I did want to ask you very quickly, who is the second most important player long-term to the Spurs right now?
Oh,
I'll give you my answer, and I don't think it's a good one. I have Devin Vasel.
Yeah, I think Vasel is my guy too. I'm kind of toggling between him and Josh Primo. And the reason because Josh Primo, like he was the one guy that you drafted with the intention of being a primary scorer and the guy that really just puts the ball in the basket. That's still what wins games in the NBA. So I think he's their most important prospect, but not necessarily their second best player right now or most valuable guy, at least in terms of conventional value to everybody else in the league.
Spins, this was fantastic as always. You are a vat, an endless, bottomless vat of information and insight. I appreciate it. Are you able to tell our listeners where they can find you and all the spectacular work that you do?
I am willing and able, Dan. Thank you again for having me on here, but follow me on Twitter at @thebox_1_. Our YouTube channel, Adam Spinella, has NBA draft scouting reports coming out pretty much every day. And then we have a Substack page that writes about those prospects in longer form, as well as some draft philosophy pieces. That's theboxand1.substack.com. All of our work comes in one of those three places. So if you hit any of those up, you're guaranteed to find something that you might disagree with.
The link to the YouTube channel is in the description. I highly recommend anyone who's going into crash course mode for the draft, like myself, needs to check it out. It's amazing. Spins, thank you so much. Congratulations in advance on the wedding. And like we said at the top, I hope that you're able to enjoy it and unplug because you work really hard. And I know myself and everyone who listens to this around these parts super appreciate all the hard work that you do.
Appreciate it.